Yeah, hi. Okay. How are you guys doing? All good? Yeah? Okay. Um, Before we start this session, I would actually like to thank Ria for writing this book. Because this book, interestingly, came to my life at a very important juncture. To give you context, I recently moved to a place, and this is the same place where I spent my teenage years in, where I did not have access to a smartphone yet, but I did have access to the internet under parental control, of course. Facebook was a huge thing. So it got me going back and forth, to understand what I was as a person before the internet to where I'm right now, where I'm surrounded by internet. So that reflection was very interesting, and because of the book. So thank you for writing the book. Coming to the book, Never Logged Out. If you guys haven't had a chance to read the book, please get a copy because it talks about the internet's influence in the creation of Gen Z identity in the Indian context. It also helps you reflect and observe your own behavior and how you interact with the internet and why you do certain things on the internet. So let's give it up for Ria Chopra, the author of Never Logged Out.
Thank you.
Hi.
Well, thank you so much, Ashwarya. That was very, very generous of you. I think we should thank our audience as well. These are people who showed up early. I think probably left Kiran Desai a little early to catch our session on time. Thank you so much for showing up. Thank you for reading my book, Ashwarya. I'm glad it found you at the right time because I feel like I wrote it at a time when I really needed to write this book. And I'm just glad it's finding its readers. I'm glad it's found you.
Okay. Speaking of the book, you started your career as a writer in various publications, if I'm not wrong. Um, did you have any sort of plan to write a book? And at which juncture, in fact, at which point in your life did you realize that this book, you had to write this book?
So one thing about me is that I'm a planner. So I have like 1 year plan, 5 year plan. So writing a book was like my 40-year plan. Like by the time I'm 40, I do it. It happened a little early, which I'm very grateful for. But yeah, I was writing about the internet on the internet mostly for a bunch of online magazines and publications for quite a while. And becoming a writer has always been the first thing I ever wanted to be. If you read my childhood like slam books, you guys know slam books, right? It's yeah. So everywhere it says what do you want to be when you grow up. It's like writer, author, magazine editor, journalist, something in that vein. So it's a matter of great privilege, and I think I stay in a consistent state of shock that I actually got to be the first thing I ever wanted to be, and it's stupendously rewarding for me just to be able to say that. But about the book about the internet in particular, I think for a while now I've been feeling that people on the internet also are gradually reckoning with what the internet has done to us. I think, especially in the last 6 months or 1 year, we are getting a lot of discourse about, say, moving back to a slightly analog life. There's 2016 nostalgia happening these days. It's crazy because 2016 was like 9 years ago, right? Not even a decade. But I think there's a yearning to have a healthier relationship with the internet and with tech at large. And I'm part of this generation. So I'm feeling the same way too. It's like the mood of the times. So
Okay.
that grew on me like that. I've been thinking about it for a while, like a couple of years. And yeah, like I ideated, I drew up the proposal, and end of the day, it's not my choice that I want to write this book. It's also the publishers that we will publish it. So thankfully, I found an editor who believed in me, and the book came about. Yeah.
In the book, you mainly talk about Gen Z's identity. Who, according to you, is a Gen Z? That's a very important question because the definitions vary across. So, who, according to you, is a Gen Z?
I'm allowed to make this a little interactive, right?
Yes.
How many of you self define as Gen Z? Can we just have a show of hands? Okay, how many of you self-define as millennials? Okay.
Okay.
I wish I could pass the mic to you, but I don't know if you're allowed to do that this early in the session.
Yeah.
But I want you to think about why. Right? For instance, when I say I am Indian, I am able to categorically say I'm Indian because I have an Indian passport, Indian parents, I was born here, I pay taxes here, etc. When I say I'm a Capricorn, I can say that because I was born on January 16th, which is when the Capricorn constellation is in the sky, and we say that the sun sign is Capricorn. How are we able to say we are Gen Z or millennials? And I've asked this question across panels that I've done, and end answer is vibes, right? Vibes pe ja rahe hum. I feel Gen Z, so I just say I'm Gen Z. Someone my age is calling themselves millennials also. Aishwarya, we're pretty much the same age, asked me backstage that I feel millennial. Is that fine? So I think this is the first thing I came across in my research because a lot of research is being done on Gen Z as a group, right? Gen Z is the loneliest generation. Gen Z is spending more than ever. Gen Z is not voting. Gen Z is voting. Who is Gen Z? And the correct answer is there is no global accepted definition of Gen Z. If you were born in 1996 in America, according to the census, you're Gen Z. If you were born in 1996 in Australia, you're not. You're millennial.
Okay.
In India, we don't have a definition. We have bigger things to worry about, I'm sure. But if you refer to Oxford Dictionary, one definition, Collins Dictionary ends Gen Z in 2012 or 15, which is late. Like that's when I started like Gen Alpha. I think reckoning with the fact that there is no universal definition is the first step to realizing that we're a very porous group of people because the single largest force that has defined us as a generation is the internet. And we all got the internet at different times.
Right.
America entirely got the internet at the same time. That's a relatively homogeneous, at least financially and with respect to tech access group. They're able to define their Gen Z as one cohort and say this is the group that got the internet together, and that's Gen Z. In India, I got internet access in 2004. If I was born in a rural part of the country, I would have got internet access in 2016 when Mukesh Ambani got Jio. That's a huge difference. That's like 11 years between me and someone my age. And that changes who we are as people. And hence, that is where my book begins. I don't want to spoil all of it. But what makes a generation is an interesting question, right? Because when we give these sweeping statements like Gen Z has mental health problems, who are we talking about? I think that's important to define and pin down. Yeah.
Well, I can call myself a Gen Z. Okay. All right. Okay. So a few days ago, I was reading a couple of reviews of your book. And a lot of people praised the amount of research that has gone into it, including me, because you've very smartly and very interestingly coupled your experience and backed it with citations and research. So how did you go about the writing process, considering the amount of research that's gone into it? Like, how were you able to pinpoint that I would use this particular study or this particular article written by so and so? How were you able to extrapolate that?
I think I was having a good time. So things like that can only happen if you're having fun. I like research. I like reading.
Right.
So the first step was just to increase my breadth of reading in general about the internet. Something I've been reading about for years, as well as writing and creating about it. So I think I had a resource base to go by. Like these are writers I can refer to.
Okay.
There's parts of the book where I refer to older philosophers, and that's stuff that I read during my college years or afterwards. A lot of philosophy is also evergreen. Like the human condition has pretty much always been the same. So what someone said like a couple of 100 years back might as easily apply today. And I quite frankly don't think the internet has changed us as people. It's changed our medium of expression. It's changed maybe the speed at which we develop and stuff like that. But fundamentally, we're the same creatures, which means the same psychology, philosophy applies to a large extent. So that's where a lot of my older referencing comes from. And then naturally, I had to also, and I like referring to more contemporary writers who are also writing about the internet because I feel like we can't not talk about what other people are saying about the same things that we are writing about. So I've referred to American writers like Taylor Lawrence and Gia Tolentino. I've referred to Indian writers and creators. Is Anurag Minus Verma here? He told me I'm going to nap and I'll be back in time for his session. So don't go for his session tomorrow because he didn't come to mine. But I have referenced Anurag Minus Verma in my book also, right? And he's a friend. He's here now. So these are contemporary Indian writers and creators and podcasters. I've referred to Substacks and YouTubes. So I think there's that multimedia referencing that's going on that can only be done by writing a book and needs to be done by writing a book about the internet. But it was like my consumption was going into like the book. These are works I was consuming anyway, and I enjoyed that. My idea also was I wanted people who read the book to feel like they were scrolling in the sense that just give them multiple stimuli all at once because I'm very, very conscious of the fact that I'm writing for a chronically online audience, right? So they're used to that volume. So I had a good time, like packing the book full of stuff and then taking a breather and being like, well, what did all of that mean? Because I feel that is the one thing we don't do while we're on the internet. We scroll reels and then we forget, right? Like I don't remember the reel I was just watching in the speaker's lounge. I think the important step is to stop and think about what we just saw or heard or read. And that's something a lot of us miss. So that's inbuilt into my book that I enjoy doing. Yeah.
You also you just spoke something that you mentioned earlier is that you said that we do not get influenced by the internet, or we are inherently the same. The internet
As human beings.
yeah, but when it comes to say consuming a sort of culture online, like for example, someone you see a certain brand that's doing really well, and it's cool to have that particular brand in your wardrobe or in your closet. Uh, isn't that changing you? Isn't that influencing your decision?
I mean, that's true, but I'd argue the root of that is in social comparison, which is essentially a human thing that has always happened. The
Okay.
speed of it has changed, medium of it has changed. My ability to do it has changed, right? It takes me 3 clicks to see a product, put in cart, Google Pay,
Yeah.
paid, I got it, right?
Yeah.
So I think that supply chain has changed to a large extent, but our needs, our wants, our inherent human condition is pretty much the same
But it's mostly influenced
by what we see online. And
Yeah.
we are seeing things online only. Like I have friends whose screen times are like 10 hours, 12 hours, which means they are on their screen and then they sleep.
Okay.
And maybe they eat in the day. Also while looking at YouTube probably. Yeah.
I also love the fact that you leave each, not chapter, but essays open ended. You give a lot of questions to the audience so that we go back and read through, we go back, question our own, what do you say, understanding of your understanding. Did you intentionally do that? Or did you want to leave it as it is?
I mean, it wasn't a conscious choice while doing it, but I realized while writing that I also don't have the answers to a lot of questions. Like reckoning with what a force has done to you is always an ongoing process. And my book aims to kickstart the conversation around it, but I don't claim to have the answers to every single question, which is why it's important to. And in the Instagram word, we call this a CTA, right? At the end of the reel, when someone gives you a call to action, so like follow me for more or link in bio. So mine is like question, like homework. Think about it, and I'll also be thinking about it. Maybe like some other time I get the answer and I write. But my secondary thing also is that a lot of people read nonfiction expecting definitive answers and a 5-point summary that this is how your life is going to change once you read this book and do these 3 things, 5 habits,
Right.
atomic habits, like subtle art of all of those things, right? I'm very conscious that this book is not going to improve someone's life by giving them 5 bullet points of this is how you should log off from the internet. In fact, I argue we shouldn't log off, like not entirely, you know. So it's that open-endedness is there because it's there in conversation. It leaves room for development of us as a generation, and I wanted to give the reader that CTA to think.
Okay. When you wrote this book, before writing this book, actually, we know that you have a good social media presence, and that's very important when it comes to publishers noticing you. Do you how did you navigate that? Because I feel like a lot of aspiring authors right now would want to also build their social profile. And today, you just can't write a book. You need to equally live it on social media. How did you go about it? Because I remember you just said that your plan to write a book was 40 years down the lane. So, what was, how do you go about building a social media presence?
Um, I think I've always been online. Like I've had the same Instagram account forever. Like that's just been what I've had. So I'm very fluent in being in the digital world. I was on Tumblr, I'm on Reddit, I'm on Instagram. So it wasn't number one like a very conscious choice for me. Ke, oh, let me open an account so I can become a creator. It's always been the same one. I think around 2022, which is when I started creating content, I often look to my counterparts in the West to get an idea of where trends in India will go because the American internet culture market used to be 5 years ahead of us. Now it's like 3 years ahead of us. And that is the time a lot of writers had also started doing commentary stuff on TikTok, which is the primary platform for them. And I took that hint and I realized that there will be a time where video, which is what all platforms are pushing, is going to be the one medium to get a new audience because people don't see text posts or like read links, click on links and read full things anymore. Um, it's but I don't want to be that kind of person who's like, "Mujhe reel nahi banani thi." Like I'm a writer and I hate making reels. I love making reels. I love talking. If you couldn't tell already, but and it's not hard, at least for me, because I'm not doing something that is not me. Like I'm creating content which looks into the themes that I'm interested in, which are also the themes that are in my book. So hence the whole thing ties together. I feel like things can be a little hard if one, you have that pressure on yourself that in 1 year I need to get 200K followers so I can sell my book. I've been creating for like 4 years. I don't have 100K, but it doesn't matter because I'm talking about the things I find interesting and people find it interesting. And it all came together in the book, you know?
Okay.
So there's that. Obviously, having a following means I can prove I have a dedicated readership that allows me to ask for more money for my work, gets me opportunities in ways that maybe other people would not get that easily. And that is how the market is working now. I feel like this question is also something that is very often asked to authors, and we should be asking publishers more about it. Aap kyun, like, why are you giving book deals to people who have never written anything in their life, right? I get the point of giving a journalist a book deal or someone who is even talking about interesting things a book deal. And famous people have always gotten book deals, like your politicians, etc. But a random creator with no visible interest in books, like that can ring a little inauthentic. And I think that's where this debate or this question stems from. That's a question for publishers to answer. I mean, very honestly, if a publisher comes to you and says, I will pay you to write a book, I don't think anyone will say no. So that onus is probably on the person who's offering the deal in the first place.
Okay.
Yeah, those are my thoughts on it.
I think that's the sort of culture. Maybe okay. It's also at the end of the day, you need to earn profits from your books. So clout makes a huge difference. All right. Coming back to the book, which was your favorite chapter to write?
I talk about
And why?
Okay, can I talk about all the chapters first?
Okay.
Because I'm conscious that there's people here who've maybe also not read the book. So it's a collection of 8 essays. All of it looks at a different value of our lives that has been changed by the internet. The first one talks about identity, and the second one talks about love. Third one talks about consumerism or like financial ambition and spending. The fourth one talks about anonymity. The fifth one talks about memory and forgetting as a concept. The sixth one talks about fame. Seventh one talks about knowledge as a concept. And the eighth one talks about representation in the sense of how do we represent Gen Z on screen and also in other media. I picked these themes because these were the most broad, very relatable things that all of us go through. And also because it is very hard to have a defined stance on any of them. You know, if I were to ask someone, what is your opinion about gender equality? There's a ready answer you can give me. But if I ask you, what do you think about memory? Like, what do you think about forgetting? What do you think anonymity is? I feel like these are interesting things that we still do have underlying opinions of, but we don't think about it as clearly in terms of statements or like political stances as we do about other things. So it was important for me to take up these values because I think this is also important to our lives, and this is something that's relatable to everyone that I'm writing for and to. My personal favorites to write, the chapter about love has been resonating a lot with a lot of people, and I found that very wholesome to write. So that was an enjoyable process. But the one about memory and forgetting, there's a lot of personal sharing also in that, and I'm talking about things that sometimes you feel like you would rather not talk about publicly. That was very difficult to write, but once I did it, I felt good, and it's been nice to be able to talk to people about it who relate to those experiences. So I think in terms of just what it's giving back, in the chapter about forgetting and how the internet doesn't let us forget, and I feel like there's so much focus put on remembering things that we forget that forgetting is an essential part of the human experience. It's what lets us move on past bad things, past loss, past heartbreak, all of those things. So I think that chapter put a lot of things in perspective for me. And yeah, like just the clarity that I got, that I like that one.
In that chapter, if I'm not wrong, you specifically talk about how when we post on the internet never forgets. Even if you have evolved as an individual from the person that you were in the past, the internet will make sure that you constantly remember that person.
I mean, we
And
see
that's a
it all
very-
the time.
Yeah,
Someone gets famous and like people start finding their
Right,
old tweets
yeah,
from
yeah.
2013 where they were like, I think there's a conversation to be had about accountability for your past personality. But if someone said something bad, like I'm not even defending it, but if someone said something bad 15 years ago and have since proved themselves to be an okay person, I feel like we can give them room to grow,
yeah.
you know?
The benefit of the doubt. Okay. Um, the book, as we talked about, has a lot of research involved, right? Because you're collating a lot of data. Today, a lot of us use tools like Obsidian and Notion and like our second brain. So wherever we find information, we add that to the tool so that we can reference it later. What was your sort of system to make sure that you don't miss out on things? Did you use any kind of personal tool?
In terms of tools.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I'm old school. I was using like Google Docs. I have a notebook and pen, and my entire book was written on Google Docs. And people will try to tell you that you should get like Notion Plus, or like there's another tool that writers keep posting about, Scrivener or something like that. It's some fancy thing that you have to pay a lot of money to use. I think you write the same only. It doesn't matter at the end of the day how much money you spent on getting a subscription to a tool. So for me, the basic ones were fine. My Google Chrome is like 500 tabs open. That was like my research space. Bookmarks are full. I have a WhatsApp group with myself, which I feel like everyone should have. And in the middle of the night at 2 a.m., when you have an idea, you can send yourself a voice note. And then you wake up in the morning, you have to decipher your own voice. But that was quite the limited tools that I use. Beyond that, I mean, you have to think, you have to write.
Yeah.
It's happening in your head most.
My God, that's crazy. You have an amazing brain then. Because I keep on forgetting. So I need a system to actually go back to.
Different strokes for different
Yeah,
folks.
makes sense.
It
Makes
works.
sense. Okay. Say that, because we're consuming a lot of content today, how do we make sure that we don't consume as it is, but we stop and critically analyze what we are consuming? Because that's something that the internet has made sure that we've forgotten to do. Because we need to criticize our own thoughts about what we are consuming. Because if we don't do that, then we're just accepting what we're receiving. So, what are the ways we can stop and critically analyze what we're consuming?
I am no expert on that just because I was able
Okay,
to.
tell me, what do you do?
I think that is something that I can answer. I have very limited screen time. It used to be 8 hours. It's like 3 hours now. That's my social media time. Work sometimes takes up more than that, but I figured out a system that works for me. log myself out from time to time. So my book title is like factually incorrect because I do log out also. It just adds an additional step in terms of you getting onto social media. I will also say, in my opinion, social media is the problem. I find the rest of the internet still okay. Like I like reading. I think Substack is fine. I watch stuff online like that. Okay. I think the dopamine pull, push, infinite scroll system, short form video stuff that is governing social media specifically is the problem. And there's all kinds of other things going on, rage baiting. I get rage baited very often, and I hate the feeling of knowing that someone made something to make you angry, and then you got angry because of it also, right? It feels like a giving up of power. And I feel like a lot of us are also doing that. Like our moods are governed by what we see on our screens and not so much about what we think about what we see on our screens. Uh, Building that thinking step back, I think, has just been my practice over the last few years. So I do it for work, which is when I have to think about what I saw. But I also have like writing as a process helps me think, talking to people helps me think. Anything that can get you off the device of consumption and process it elsewhere, I think that's a healthy enough way to process and like critically think about what you saw. Personally, I also like having inbuilt offline hobbies into my life. So I quiz, as I've been quizzing since school. I competitively quizzed in college, and it's an activity for which you have to put your phone away. Like it's not allowed, according to the rules, to have your phone in front of you. So for those 3 hours or 6 hours on a Sunday, I'm just not on my phone. And I think having that time where your brain is still engaged, but in something else, not in constant consumption, but in a thinking state, that helps for me. And I have friends who are doing crosswords, who are doing other stuff, dancing, crocheting is big. Anything that reading, of course, which is what I assume everyone here also has as a hobby. I think anything that gets you off the device for a little while is also helpful.
Even I feel like consuming knowledge and information so that you're able to retort back to, say, you watch a reel and you don't immediately accept it as it is, but you're able to question it also. That is the skill that comes with a lot of reading and gaining a lot of knowledge. Reading your book, maybe. Okay.
So I also feel like skepticality is really built into real life conversation. Like people will doubt you over the littlest of things. Like, say I was topper in school, huh? Like it's like that, you know. But sometimes what we see online, people just accept straight up. And I feel like sometimes the persuasion, the tonality of what you're seeing, or you know how our grandparents feel like everything they're seeing on TV is true. Like my grandfather is like paper mein aaya, so it's true, written, so it's factually correct. I think maybe there's like a tendency to believe what a well-dressed, well-spoken, English-speaking person with good background animation is telling you, and it's not always true. I do still see younger people having an instinct for being able to tell when something is AI or a deep fake or fake news because it just doesn't sound right. But people only slightly older than us are still falling prey to it. And AI is reaching a point where it's going to be hard to tell even for us. So I think having that skepticality in your online life also is nice and is important.
Speaking about that, we just posted a reel about it on Pink Lungi where we talk about how our parents' generation aren't able to identify the difference between fake news as well as fake news versus real news, especially when it comes to AI content. So, do you think it's our responsibility to teach them the difference, or is it something like how we learned it on our own? Do we also give them the space to learn it on their own?
This is something I touch upon in a different way in my book also when I talk about how it's harder to learn anything when you're older in the sense of, like, I speak two languages fluently, English and Hindi. I don't even remember how I learned them, right? I was a child. I picked up Sanskrit in school. That was also not very hard. If now I decide to start learning a new language, I feel like it's going to be harder. Older than, I think there's an age also after which it becomes harder to learn a language. So the same way, I think digital fluency also falls in that bracket. So an older person inherently having been on the internet in a different way than us. Like a lot of our parents, for instance, spent the same time on the internet as us. Like in India, we got the internet in 1995 officially, but most homes got it in 2004, which is when the government introduced a broadband policy. So technically, my father and I have been on the internet the same amount of time.
Yeah.
But he entered it when he was older, and I entered it when I was younger, which is maybe that youngness and the malleability of my brain picked up the contours of the internet better than his did, and I was using it to play. So I feel like you learn things more when you play versus he was using it for email and work, and he didn't pick those things up. So it's what I'm trying to say is it's not willful ignorance that they're not able to tell when something is not AI or is AI or is fake news. It's just part of how they pick the internet up. Do I see it as my responsibility to educate every older man who tries to tell me like ye hua and like see it says this? No. But I feel like the people close to us, if we wish good for them, I mean, we can do it. It's something that takes a lot of time because tools get better every single day. Like, look at the image generative capabilities of AI from like 6 months ago versus now, right? Harder for us to keep up with it also. So it's so hard for that generation to do it. But I think there's room to at least help them like get used to it.
Probably have a conversation with them.
Because it's not just fake news, right? It's crazy things are happening. There's this cyber fraud that is happening in Delhi where they do cyber arrest of people. Do you have it here? No. People in Delhi have crores of money stolen from them because someone with an authoritative voice calls them and tells them, I'm from the police and don't go outside your house and keep your video on and pay me like 5 crores. Uh, Crazy. And it's happening, right? Because they have no one to maybe talk to about the fact that I got a phone call like this or there's a lack of trust or something. I feel like at least for cases like this, there's sensitization and like knowledge sharing to be done. But it's not every young person's responsibility to be like, I'm gonna educate boomers about it's okay. It's they're weird also sometimes. I don't see it as my responsibility.
We basically don't take the pressure of it. Oh, yeah. Unless it's your own parents, you probably
Exactly.
have. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. In your book, you also talk about how it's important that we take give ourselves permission to log out, right? So that we are off the internet, so that we see who we are beyond the internet space. While that's a great way to go about it, it's not that easy to get out of the internet, considering it's an important part of our lives 24/7. We're always there. So, what would you suggest a couple of ways to log off, to not look at the internet? Like the moment you wake up, we are always on our phone. We have to see what something as basic as looking at the time. So, what would you suggest? How do we log off?
Once again, I could talk about what's worked out for me, and this is something I want to write about. I am, in fact, writing an essay about this for a publication also, but let me also try to put it in words. I feel like a lot of times when we have this conversation about it's time to log off, the internet is still this main character in that conversation, and it's still that specter that is looming over our offline activity. So the whole time you've logged out and you're reading a book, you're mentally like, oh, I'm not on my phone, I'm reading. I see a lot of people doing these Sunday supper clubs and book clubs, and it's no phone zone. And then everyone somehow has photos of them also, and they go home and make a reel about it also. I feel like the correct way to start logging out is to decenter the internet and like smartphones at large from your life so thoroughly that you don't even think about them. And I feel like we naturally have these movements sometimes, right? Like when we're having a really good conversation with a friend, I'm not thinking about taking a selfie with them in that moment. I'm having a good, what we call in the moment, right? When I'm quizzing, like my brain is so activated, I'm not thinking about, oh, what's happening on Instagram right now. I feel like finding those pockets of life where the internet does not exist for you, and then trying to broaden the space that has in your life. I feel like that is how we start. And the more time we give to those things that we enjoy, I think naturally phone usage, internet usage will come down. At least it has for me, right? Give yourself higher order thinking skills, pleasures, and then the shallow dopamine stops mattering as much anymore. I think that's how we start. Of course, there's short-term things you can do like turn off your notifications. My phone goes black and white at 9 p.m. That has helped immensely because Instagram is not fun when everything is black and white. So I'm just not there anymore. I log out, like I said, from time to time just to make things harder for me to log back in. And
Okay.
I don't have apps on my phone. Like I use the Chrome tab to like
Okay.
access Reddit or Twitter or whatever I want to. I have Instagram because that's work.
Like
But
you're
the
making
others,
your life even more difficult so that you don't get.
add friction back in. I think it's a great thing to have like steps that force you to do more. And then it feels like फिर मैं क्यों करूँ Twitter? Like I do, it's not important. I have to get 2 OTP and then they put in my birth date and do like blah. It's fine. I don't need to see tweets, while I'm on the metro. So I think adding that back, at least for me, it's helped, and my screen time is proof of that. Things might work differently for other people, but everyone I've given this advice to has like thanked me for it. So maybe you can take this advice also.
I'm going to. I also feel like, if you occupy your hands by doing, say, something with art and crafts or writing, journaling, that sort of takes you away from your phone a lot.
I have a theory that that's why pottery really took off some years back. Because when your hands are dirty, then you can't use your smartphone. So pottery classes are the big thing in Delhi. Pottery, pizza making, and specific things that require you to get like down and dirty with things. My like fan theory is that it's because you can't use your phone while you're doing it.
Right. Okay, so I think it's almost not time. I think I would like to open it to the crowd. But before that, one last question. Can you recommend 3 books that you would gift a friend?
I would give.
Yeah, apart from your book.
I was about fell over. Like, मेरा नाम भी दे दो. My book, obviously, but apart from that, one of my favorite books is Desperately Seeking Shahrukh by Shreyana Bhattacharya. She's also done me the honor of blurbing my book. It's a non-fiction book that uses Shah Rukh Khan as a statistical tool to look at the socioeconomic status of women in India, which I think is an incredible premise and sold me on it immediately. But her writing is also so funny. It makes for a very, very gripping book. Meet the Savarnas by Professor Ravikant Kisana is one that I finished recently. It came out 6, 7, 8 months back. Incredible book that looks at just how caste is built into society, but he has a lot of chapters looking at the internet specifically that I in fact referred to while writing my book also. So love that. And as a classic, I'm like a murder mystery fan. So Agatha Christie is like queen, but I'm really, really enjoying the Thursday Murder Club series by Richard Osman. Do not watch the Netflix movie; it sucks. But read the books; they are very, very good. And it's one of the first murder mysteries to make me cry. Has anyone read the Thursday Murder Club? Have you read the 3rd or 4th? You know what I'm talking about. You cried, no? Like that, yeah. So yeah, like you don't expect a murder mystery to do that, but it's so cozy. The characters are so lovely. Incredible book series.
Thank you so much. Okay, do we have any questions for Ria? All right. Okay, a couple of them.
Very interesting conversation there. Though the Gen Z gets blamed for being glued to the internet, the older generation are also predominantly leading a virtual life, like you suggested. My question is, how do you separate in terms of personality the Gen Z and the generations which preceded it and those who follow after Gen Z? What impact would the internet have on these other generations? I think you referred to the older generation being gullible, for instance, how they easily dupe. So apart from that, what other influences and how does it affect the personality of these generations?
A distinction I draw in my book also that I think can form a foundation to that answer is that when younger people, we were in our adolescence and some of us in our teens, when we got onto the internet, our personality was still a work in progress, which means that we were doing identity formation as well as identity expression on the internet. If someone beyond the age of like 30, 35 with a pretty solid self-image enters the internet, they're predominantly using it for identity expression. Not so much for formation, though you do see influences coming in here and there. And I feel like the effects of that compound over time. Like a lot of younger people are still using the internet as a medium to create, to share, to talk about themselves, to consume also from people that they like and whose work they enjoy, but to also have that engagement going. I feel like older people, and I'm generalizing heavily here, is more of a consumption economy. We see that heavily in terms of like WhatsApp forwards as a concept where everyone's just sending it to each other. Somehow that is communication, right? I feel like you also see that in terms of like reels as they come on Facebook. What do they call them? Facebook? Shorts?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot of consumption heavy things, not so much creation. I think that's a key distinction that I draw. The second one that we touched upon here is the susceptibility of older people to fall for deepfakes or fake news, which is due to a slightly limited digital fluency. Younger people are still to some extent capable of telling when something is AI generated or just not logically making sense. I'd say I also personally think that older people also get rage baited quite frequently. Like I see older people getting very agitated that see what Pakistan is doing and see what, and it's all based on, and I'm not saying don't get angry about that. The amount of influence the internet has over their emotions is often not spoken about. We talk a lot about young people, like their mood depends on the internet and, they live online lives, blah, blah, blah. The older generation is equally and to some extent in larger ways also doing that. And I think that's key there as well.
Hi.
Hello. Hi, Ria Chops. That's how I know you for the past 2 years, I think. I've been following you on Instagram. I think your personality has grown over a long time. But one thing that I've struck, I'm also a quizzer. I'm a doctor by profession. I'm a millennial person. So how do you, how has your growth? One, I'm very curious about women in quizzing also, because anytime when I go for a quiz, I've always seen a scarcity of them. And I keep encouraging my students also, please, women do have to. I remember you talking about something in school that in a school quiz, only you knew the answer, but you were hesitant to answer because you were a girl and you felt afraid to answer it. I know I'm digressing from your book, but I admire the personality you are. That's why I've been. You are an inspiration for a lot of Gen Zs. So it's not just your book. I do recommend your books to my students. But you do, I think, how does your quizzing has been helping you as a person and also as a writer? Because any of your reels, you said, if I watch this movie, I see this word, fanning, and what do I get from that word? So I'm not stalking you on Instagram, but I don't know how Instagram keeps giving me your reels day by day. Even your update today that you're there on KLF just came because I was just traveling here from Bangalore. So how's quizzing been?
That's a very, very good question. And you apologize for digressing, but I wish people asked me more because it's a hobby I love talking about. I think quizzing by its nature makes you focus on multiple interesting things about one thing at the same time. So if I like Harry Potter, for instance, right? The amount of takeaway that I will have from Harry Potter as a quizzer is not just the story, but like random facts about, all the spells are Latin words that actually mean the exact same thing that the spell does in Latin. Just an example, but attention to detail is what I'm trying to say is one of the key things that I take away from quizzing, and I feel like I put that a lot in my book. I also love references because quizzing is about getting the reference a lot of times. My book is full of references, and a lot of people haven't got all of them yet, but the opening is a reference, for instance, to Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and then there's a lot of like memes, etc. thrown in. So just that peppering of random facts and random trivia and references throughout it adds more flavor. At least I feel that way. So I think my writing is heavily influenced from that. I also like in Delhi, we do funda quizzing, right? Which is you have a long paragraph telling a story and then the answer is like something you have to derive from that. It's not short questions like what is the capital of XYZ. It's like in 1900s, this happened, blah, blah. So I think that storytelling of it and driving home a point is also something I took away from quizzing and I put in my book. In general, like I said, it keeps my mind healthy, honestly. It's one of the few activities where I feel so mentally engaged that I don't think about, oh, the reel I posted this morning, how is it performing? It's just, it takes me so offline and so deep into knowledge spaces. And you meet very cool people through quizzing. So yes, while that thread is about how women sometimes feel out of place in quizzing, and that's one of the most popular things I've ever written. It's spread far and wide. I will say that I've made very, very good friends out of quizzing, many of whom helped and contributed in the writing of my book in terms of proofreading the draft, etc. And yeah, it's given me like a lot. And I wish to continue quizzing for like as much as possible. We can take more questions. I also tend to speak a lot, so feel free to like cut me off.
Hi, so I'm a teacher by profession. So when I have been observing, I observe that a lot of students, especially of mine who are Gen Zs, they don't post much on social media. Their posts, the number of posts are actually zero, but they are there watching. So the number of posts are zero, the Gen Zs, most of my students. So I just want to understand, do you think it is a withdrawal symptom that they are showing due to fear of judgment? Or are they intentionally creating their social spaces where they value authenticity more than digital visibility? Thank you.
Paraphrase that.
So she was like, she's a teacher. So most of her students on social media, they don't post much, but rather they post on stories.
Yeah.
So are they creating their own social identity over there by not,
For posting zero, and it's apparently been happening a lot these days. I think the globally recognized cause of that's been spoken about is an oversaturation of content that they're consuming. And then the derivative thought is, I am also just, it's like I'm putting another drop into the ocean, like I keep seeing so many photos, so many reels every day. Does what I post matter, etc.? What is concurrently happening is a return to what people call walled gardens on social media, which is Finsta accounts, like private closed accounts or closed friends list. And I see a movement back, see a Snapchat happening where you can add friends. So I think while younger people particularly are maybe going away from hyper posting the way we were encouraged to do, they're still posting and sharing in ways online that they've identified as safer or healthier for them. And I think it's okay. I don't see it as a good or a bad thing or like an identity thing. I think it's a phase that's happening right now. But they're using the same platforms just in different ways.
Hi, Ria. So one thing I noticed is I read your book in two sittings because that's how interesting I found it. But one thing I noticed is, so there's Anurag who's also written about a very similar topic on brain rot and Gen Z. And that's very different from your book. So I just wanted to understand what the things you have deleted or not written about that you initially wanted to write. And also how I don't see a lot of politics. Is that something that is lesser in growing up in Delhi where you don't actually talk about politics while growing up? Because I think in Kerala, we do talk about politics a lot, even while growing up as teenagers. So yeah, that's.
Can you paraphrase? Okay. Your first question was Anurag and I have written books that are both about the internet, but in different ways. No.
Yeah. So you talk about very different topics.
Yeah.
The people who you talk about,
Yeah.
like Anurag talks about Puneet Superstar. You talk about a different range of people. So there's a lot of difference in what you wrote.
Yeah.
So what was the choice of what you deleted
Theme,
and
okay.
what you kept?
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah. And the second question was, how does politics come into play in terms of?
no, how,
So the second question is, politics is a very big part of how we posted on Instagram while growing up in Kerala.
Yeah.
I don't see that kind of a connect while you've written in the book.
Yeah.
So is it something that's lesser in Delhi or? Yeah.
Okay. I'll answer in order. I think the first one, like I said, his work is something I referred to in my book. He's older and hence has been writing for a lot longer than me. His areas of interest just lie in subcultures and more specifically caste dynamics of subcultures, which is what a lot of his book focuses on. I think by virtue of lived experience, my interests lie in a slightly different, more philosophical look at how the internet has changed me as a young person. So it's a byproduct, I think, of what naturally interests us. We've been in conversation on a lot of panels. In fact, I think this is the first Lit Fest we're doing where we are not on a panel together. So it's nice to do stuff like that because both our books are also an acknowledgement of the fact that there's a huge internet that we don't cover, right? Like this is not a mutual, very exclusive, like this is a small part of the internet. So to be able to have more narratives and hence different perspectives and different fragments of the internet be documented and talked about, I think that's interesting. For me, like it's purely things that I feel I have enough new things to say about, innovative things to say about, and that strike a chord with me in terms of lived experience. Second question, yeah, I'm in huge admiration of Kerala's politically aware and like outspoken culture in terms of even kids and like the way kids grow up here. In Delhi, that's not always the case. Thankfully, I went to Delhi University, which is a central university. So at least and I was like 18. So that's when I came into contact with people who had lived realities that were different from mine. And I'll be the first person to admit that before that, I was extremely sheltered, like private school, like a relatively affluent part of Delhi, parents who have the same kinds of friends as them, and hence you are with the same kind of people as you, both in terms of class, but also caste, and governed by very similar hierarchies. So I think it's something that, like my political consciousness came a little later. I did a lot of reading, thankfully, in college. I studied literature that exposed me to a lot of like political theory and thoughts that I hadn't thought of before. That it started coming in. Is my writing not political? I wouldn't say it is, right? You seem to have read the book. The consumerism chapter is pretty much me referring to Marx as like a cornerstone of what makes objects identity today. I think it's also about considering what we consider politics, like is saying, fuck, can I said it. Is that politics? Sure. But I think also being able to say that the gender dynamics of a particular situation are operating, that's also political. And I feel like there's broader socio-political, maybe I'd say that, themes underlying in my work and in my book. There are things I feel educated enough to talk about, so then I talk about them. There are things where I don't, so I reshare what other people are saying, and that's how I see my role. I'm still a work in progress. I'm not the most like 100% politically educated person, but I'm doing my reading and doing my best. And when I feel educated enough, probably more of that will come in my work. Thank you for that question.
I think she.
Hi, Ria. I'm a big fan of who you are, what you do, and how your brain works. So my question to you is, what do you think lies ahead? Like, what's the future for us? What does internet look like in, say, 10 years, 20 years? What do you think? What's your perspective on it?
Can I just say, like, everyone loves asking that question because speculation about the future is often like betting, right? Like, I can say something, it can be very nice. Maybe I'll be right, maybe I'll be wrong. I can say something very horrible also, and maybe I'll be right, maybe I'll be wrong. What is happening now? I feel like a lot of us don't even know that. What is happening with AI now? How is our government using AI? How is the company you're working for integrating AI into its workforce? And 1 month from now, they're going to lay off like lakhs of people. What's going to happen? I feel like awareness about the present, at least for me, is much more important than speculating about the future. Just in terms of like broad trends on the internet that I see, I think gender discussions online are going to become extremely toxic. I'm on Reddit where most trends start. And let me tell you, like the men-only subreddits there are a bad place to be in. And that's how young kids are growing up, right? With your Andrew Tates and other influences like that, but also in pockets of Indian men like them online and just growing in that kind of discourse. So that's one. AI obviously taking over huge pressure both on the workforce, but also in terms of how we consume content. Third, I do see some return of people trying to strike a balance in terms of not being as chronically online as they are. I think the book is finding a larger readership because people are in their frame of mind. You know, they want to think about what the internet has done to them and how they can stop more non-consensual transformation from happening. I think those 3 things I'm pretty confident about. Others, I also don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think they can kick us out. We can just keep sitting. Nitya is looking at me like, we will kick you out.
Hello, I'm sorry if my question is too long. But I do have 2 questions. First one is, you just talked about how we're logging off, or the hobbies that you do when you log off. But even when you're logged off, we're living, or we're very much ingrained into this digital sphere that you, even when you're doing journaling or even when you're doing sketching, you are in a way thinking about posting about journaling or posting a story about how I journal, how I attend sessions or whatever it is. So in a way, you're not really logged off even when you are away from your phone. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that. And my second question is, we live in a reality where the Instagram feeds us. We perceive or we see what Instagram wants us to see. So recently we see that videos about Palestine or Gaza, it has been stringed up into ASMR videos or some other Taylor Swift videos, interesting videos, so that it reaches us. And they are also encouraging us to comment about all these other popular people so that the engagement increases. So what do you think about this whole facade of Instagram algorithm?
I think the first question is something that I already talked about. Like my thought on that is happening. We have to do our personal work, like work on ourselves to try to decenter the internet from our lives the way it has been centered in it. As to your second question, I mean, the Instagram algorithm is diabolical, right? And I think one of the largest things it's done that we don't talk about enough is the removal of disagreement altogether. Like I see the videos that I agree with. I like a few of them. It will show me more like them. AI also, if you've used AI tools, will just agree with whatever you're saying. Like, yes, you're right. Which is why I feel a lot of younger people don't know how to handle conflict because like that disagreement aspect is being removed from our lives altogether. That's one. Like, I think the Instagram algorithm is nefarious and like horrible in that way. Secondly, in terms of shadow banning political posts and then people having to use guerrilla measures to pretty much try to make sure that their content is shown. I think it's something people are learning to do. I find it quite nice. Like I love when people beat the algorithm by doing something, different. I think we should be sharing them. We should be commenting on them. It's the shitty part about being on Instagram is that you can't get rid of the algorithm. Like it is what governs the platform. The only way to move beyond it is to get off the platform and get your news from elsewhere. Go to discussion groups. Go to reading groups. Like that's what I try to do. It's a shitty thing. I don't like to think about the algorithm at all. It sucks. Mark Zuckerberg, who's built it, is minting money off of. I don't have words for how horribly it's fucking up young people's brain. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much. You speak amazing, by the way. Okay. All right.